Hey everybody, Dr. Phil here. This is going to be a video that discusses marketing in the standpoint, in the context of the global environment. So let's just go ahead and jump right in, shall we? All right, so the competitive environments. So the marketing environment includes domestic and international factors. So of course, domestic being, here in the US or whatever country you're sort of domiciled in, international factors being other countries. So a couple of things we'll look at in this video: direct competition versus indirect competition. So direct competition, the example would be Sirius XM and Spotify. And then bearing in mind there are also substitute products that people can use, right? So just think of like substitute products as something else that I could substitute. If I don't want to buy Sirius, I don't want to pay the subscription, I don't want to pay the subscription to Spotify, and I'm tired of the free one with all the ads, then I may go like Pandora, I may go pick something else. So that would be an example of a substitute. And then indirect competition would be something like, again, Sirius XM versus Apple iPhone. So yeah, there's some kind of overlap. Obviously you got Apple Music, iTunes. So you could, yeah, that kind of competes with Sirius XM, but obviously Sirius is not providing phone service, cellular service, whereas of course Apple iPhone is. So direct competition, as we mentioned Sirius XM. So marketing professionals at Sirius XM and every organization must recognize the challenges both direct and indirect competition presents and develop strategies to protect and expand their organization in light of those challenges. So you got to think about, what is my current direct and indirect competition? What is likely going to be my future direct and indirect? So it isn't always just about, what's going on in the here and now, while that's important. It's also looking ahead. And then indirect competition. So firms that closely monitor indirect competition can take steps to reduce its impact by expanding their offerings. An example would be Coca-Cola did this in response to competition from firms promoting healthy alternatives to soft drinks. And as you see here, the picture is Dasani. Obviously, that's bottled water. It's actually owned by, a lot of people don't realize this, it's actually owned by Coca-Cola. So what about the external marketing environment? So if we look at this sort of idea of environmental scanning, like imagine like scanning, looking around to see what's going on in the environment we operate in. So these are some external factors that affect the marketing environment. Obviously, one is economic, another one is demographic, sociocultural, political, legal, and technological. So these are all, external factors that would affect the marketing environment. So a term you may be familiar with, this is more out of sort of the economics literature, is GDP, gross domestic product. So recessions typically involve layoffs, increased unemployment, and reduced consumer confidence, all of which can affect negatively GDP, gross domestic product. So income distribution, if we take like Dollar General, then obviously they market to low income families, whereas like Bentley are obviously marketing to high income people. Inflation can speak to purchasing power because obviously with inflation, your purchasing power is typically diminished because you can buy less because things are now, unless you've gotten commensurate raises, you can buy less because your dollars just don't stretch as far as they normally would. So obviously, consumer confidence affects consumer spending. Hyundai's buyer assurance program, they did this sort of buyback type program to try to. They were having a lot of problems with people having issues with their vehicles, so it was pretty much like, hey, if you do, then just be basically just bring it back, and we will give you your money back. That's one way that they could increase their sales and subsequent consumer confidence. So demographic factors, things like age, generation, like here they mentioned baby boomers, how much disposable income people have. Millennials typically have lower disposable income because they're sort of like newer into the workforce, certainly than baby boomers, if we compare it to them. As far as gender goes, interestingly, females control 85% of consumer spending. Obviously, education affects unemployment. I mean, not in every case, but most times, the higher educated you are, the more employable you're going to be. And again, depending on what field you go into. And then, of course, ethnicity. Minority populations in the US are, of course, growing. And then sociocultural factors. So, shift from single income to two income families. There are more single adults now than there's ever been, and that trend is projected to continue. The rising concerns about consumer privacy because all our information now is pretty much all over the internet. You'll constantly hear about companies being hacked, data breaches, a growth in environmental consciousness, excuse me. So we've seen things like ESG, we're in the context of financial reporting, like environmental, social, and governance, and also cultural differences, right? Because now, as countries become more diverse, then obviously, there's sort of all these different cultures that are, sort of living and operating alongside each other. Political factors, this is certainly true. There's always a changing political climate, right? Whether it's, this political party or that political party, everybody has their own ideas, their own platform, their own manifesto. So obviously governmental policy affects how marketers position products. So for example, if there's a tax increase on video games, if you're EA Sports, EA Games, then obviously that's not good for you. If anything, you'd want it to go the other way and there be a tax decrease on video games. And then of course the increasing influence of what we call PAC, political action committees. So that may be something you've not heard of. These are kind of behind the scenes. No one kind of talks about these too much, and I think that's probably purposeful. But they certainly wield a lot of power. And then legal factors. One is to ensure businesses compete fairly. So that's the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, and to ensure that businesses don't take advantage of consumers. So things like truth in advertising, truth in lending, for example. We could also think about technology factors, which influence how consumers satisfy their needs and wants. So things like Apple's iTunes and iPods would, of course, be, excuse me, good examples of those. And then changes how firms promote products. So if we think about like the transition from landlines to smartphones, 20 years ago, very few people had phones. I mean, obviously smartphones weren't a thing then, but very few people had the big old like brick phones back in the day. Um, and everybody had a landline, right? Whereas now, pretty much nobody has a landline anymore. They're very hard to find. Everybody just uses their cell phones. Currency fluctuation, and certainly if you deal with, vendors, suppliers, customers overseas, then you have to worry about the currency exchange rate, sometimes called the spot rate, like the on the spot, like what is that rate today? And obviously that changes in the future. It changes throughout the day. There's even like an intraday rate. Obviously, US products in China cost less because the US currency, the US dollar, is much stronger than the Chinese yuan. Income distribution that helps provide a country's purchasing power. So obviously, it's not just about making good money. It's like if you a good example would be like if you took a job in New York City and you were making 100,000 a year. Down here, that's a lot of money in North Carolina, but up there, that's really not because the rent's going to be probably three times what you would pay down here. So your purchasing power up there is less because your money just yeah, you're making 100 grand, but it just doesn't stretch as far. And then we also have major trade agreements and organizations. So the EU, obviously one of the largest economies in the world. Brexit speaks to the exit of the United Kingdom from the European Union. For there wasn't just financial reasons. There were some political reasons too. One was related to immigration, but there were also some financial reasons as well. The World Trade Organization, commonly abbreviated the WTO, got about 162 members. That's the majority of nations in the world. And then also the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, sort of the 188 countries. So sometimes we'll call the IMF kind of like the lender of last resort because the IMF is kind of where countries go with like, hey, like want to build this dam or we want to do something like really, some expensive capital project and they don't have the money for it. Then they may, not guaranteed, but they may be able to get the money out of the IMF. Obviously, they got to pay it back and presumably with interest, although I believe the IMF has given out interest-free loans in the past, but probably a lower interest rate, if anything. So that's just a little bit about the international marketing environment. Just bear in mind, like as soon as you go overseas, there's nothing wrong with that. Obviously, most companies do it now, but because we live in a very global world, but you just got to think about all the extra factors that now come into play with respect to, okay, we've got to worry about currency, about political instability overseas, just to name a couple. All right, short video here. Thanks for watching, and I will see you all in a future video. Take good care.